Most agencies assume that once they hit a certain revenue milestone, especially something like $1 million, things will finally feel easier, more stable, more confident, and less reactive. But that's often not what actually happens. I've watched agencies reach the exact same revenue number and end up in completely different realities. One feels grounded and intentional, the other feels brittle, stretched, and constantly on. Same revenue, very different experiences. And what's interesting is that the difference usually has nothing to do with talent, ambition, or effort. In this episode, I want to slow that contrast down and really look at it, not to judge which version is better, but to understand what it reveals about how agencies are designed to grow and why growth can start to feel heavier instead of lighter, even when things look successful on paper. If you've wondered why hitting milestones hasn't delivered the ease you've expected, this conversation will give you a lens for understanding what's actually going on underneath the business. Here we go. Welcome to the Small But Mighty Agency podcast. If you want to grow an agency to 7 figures and beyond without working more hours in your business, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Audrey Joy Kwan. I know what it takes to build an agency, including supporting an agency owner in selling and exiting. I also have a master's degree in communications, specializing in organizational development. My team and I have worked behind the scenes of multiple 7-figure agencies and have coached and consulted with over 150 agency owners. All this to say, when you join us on the Small But Mighty Agency podcast, you get real world experience and practical tips that help you work less, earn more, and lead with integrity. So let's go. Hey friends, if you've been running an agency for any amount of time, there's a good chance you felt this quiet tension before. You have ambition, a deep care for the quality of the work, a real desire for the agency to grow, to be profitable, respected, and sustainable, and to create more freedom, not less. And yet, when you look at the version of success the agency industry keeps holding up, something pulls you back. Not because growth is scary and not because confidence is lacking, but because the path being offered feels like it comes with a hidden cost that doesn't quite sit right. It's always more clients, more volume, more people to manage, more complexity, and more pressure. And if there's ever been a moment where you've thought, I don't actually want that, followed immediately by the question of whether that means you're thinking too small, playing it safe, or lacking ambition, let's dig into it. Today, let's talk about something I call the small but mighty agency identity, not as a tactic or positioning angle, but as a legitimate, intentional way to build a highly profitable agency without scaling volume, or what I call empire building. Because most agency owners I work with aren't stuck because they lack skill, ambition, or work ethic. Far from it. They're stuck because they're trying to grow inside a model that wasn't designed for the kind of agency they actually want to build. And when you're operating inside that wrong model, even the right moves can start to feel heavy. There's something that rarely gets named in agency growth conversations, but once you see it, it's hard to unsee. There's an unspoken agreement baked into most advice. It goes something like this. Growth comes from more clients, more output, more people, more reach. And if growth feels hard, the solution is usually to push further in that same direction. What's interesting is how rarely anyone ever says this agreement out loud. Instead, it shows up in casual comments and well-meaning advice. Things like, once we get more clients, it'll feel easier. Or we just need to hire one more person and then it'll stabilize. Or we're not ready to raise prices yet. We need more proof first. None of these statements are unreasonable on their own. They sound practical, responsible even. They sound like what a smart business owner should be thinking. But over time, they quietly lock you into a growth path that assumes volume is the answer to everything. And if you've been in this industry long enough, you've probably watched this play out, not just in your own business, but in others. Agencies that keep adding clients, keep adding people, keep adding complexity, and somehow feel less steady with every milestone they hit. This logic didn't come from nowhere. It made sense at a certain point in time. Agencies grew by adding people, revenue increased by taking on and completing more client work, scale was how you create margin and stability. But this model also assumes something very specific. It assumes that size is the goal. It assumes that empire building is the natural endpoint of ambition. And if that assumption doesn't match what you actually want, everything starts to feel off. Saying no feels risky because every client feels necessary. Growth feels like more pressure instead of more clarity. Even success can start to feel like it's working against your life rather than supporting it. What often makes this harder is that from the outside, things look fine. Revenue is growing, clients are happy, other people might even say you're doing great. And yet internally, you feel more stretched, more reactive, more hesitant to make changes because everything feels so tightly balanced. One wrong move, one lost client, one misstep, and the whole thing feels like it could wobble. That's usually the moment you start questioning yourself. You wonder why growth doesn't feel the way you expected it to, why more success hasn't translated into more ease, why confidence feels so fragile, even though objectively you're doing well. And that's where the quiet shame can creep in, because if everyone else seems to be scaling and celebrating, and you're feeling heavier instead of lighter, it's easy to assume the problem must be you. And that feeling of instability comes from how the business is set up, not who you are. It's what happens when a business depends on constant motion to stay upright. The question why this feels harder instead of easier sits at the heart of the small but mighty agency identity. When I say small but mighty, I'm not talking about staying small forever. I'm not talking about opting out of growth, and I'm definitely not talking about lifestyle minimalism. I'm talking about agencies that are deliberately designed to grow through value, trust, and fit rather than volume. Small but mighty agencies are ambitious, but they're selective. They're not trying to be everything to everyone. They're trying to matter deeply to the right people. They care about impact per client more than client count. They care about relevance more than reach. They care about building a business that works financially and supports a real life. This distinction matters more now than it ever has. Execution is easier to access than ever. Noise is louder. AI is accelerating commoditization. The things that used to differentiate agencies are becoming baseline expectations. And in this environment, scale doesn't automatically create stability. In many cases, it creates fragility, more moving parts, thinner margins, a less room to think, and less room to choose. Depth, on the other hand, becomes more valuable. Trust becomes more valuable, fit becomes more valuable, and yet most agencies are still measuring success by size. I want to slow things down and make it very tangible. Imagine two agencies that both reach $1 million in revenue. On paper, they look the same top line number, same external marker of success. But how they get there tells a very different story. In the first agency, revenue comes from around 50 clients. Each engagement is relatively small, pricing is tight, margins depend on efficiency and constant outputs. If you zoom into a typical week, the owner's time is fragmented. Monday starts with internal check-ins, client calls, and problem solving. By Tuesday, they're context switching constantly, fielding questions, smoothing things over, making sure nothing slips. Pricing conversations tend to feel cautious, and scope creep shows up often because saying no feels risky. When a client has an emergency, everything else gets pushed aside. Even when the owner isn't technically working, they're mentally on. There's always something that needs attention. Now imagine the second agency. This agency reaches the same revenue with 15 clients. Each engagement is larger. The work is more strategic. The agency understands its clients deeply, not just the projects, but their business. A typical week looks different. There's more continuity, fewer handoffs, fewer competing priorities. And decisions don't feel rushed because fewer things are demanding attention at once. Pricing conversations are grounded in outcomes, not effort. Scope creep is easier to manage because the relationship is built on trust and clarity. When a client has emergency, it doesn't derail everything else. Owner spends less time reacting and more time thinking. There's room to refine the work, deepen expertise, and design the business intentionally. Neither of these agencies is inherently better, but they feel very different to run. And that difference has nothing to do with ambition, intelligence, or talent. It comes down to the growth logic underneath the business. Small but mighty agencies built with this awareness. We don't assume that more clients is the answer. We design for value density. In other words, we design for trust, continuity, and fit. Instead of asking, how do we get more clients? The question becomes, how do we create more value, trust, and fit with the right ones? That shift may seem small, but it changes everything. When you stop optimizing for volume, both consciously and unconsciously, decisions start to move in different direction. Growth becomes something you shape to support your life rather than something that happens to you, and the business grows with more control. Small but mighty agencies build with this awareness. We don't assume that more clients is the answer. We design for value density. In other words, we design for trust, continuity, and fit. Instead of asking, how do we get more clients? The question becomes, how do we create more value, trust, and fit with the right ones? That shift may seem small, but it changes everything. When you stop optimizing for volume, both consciously and unconsciously, decisions start to move in different direction. Growth becomes something you shape to support your life rather than something that happens to you, and the business grows with more control. This is the part that often gets overlooked. The real risk isn't choosing the wrong growth model. The real risk is never consciously choosing one at all. When you don't name how you want your agency to grow, you default to the loudest advice in the room. And over time, that default quietly shapes your impact, your services, your calendar, and eventually your life. Drift doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly. A client you probably shouldn't take, a service you add just in case, a hire that solves today's problem but creates tomorrow's complexity. Without a clear identity, it's easy to wake up one day inside a business that looks successful from the outside but feels misaligned on the inside. The small but mighty agency identity names a path that many agency owners might be intuitively sensing, but haven't been given permission to fully claim. And that permission matters because when you realize you don't have to become bigger to become more successful, you start designing differently. When you stop equating growth with hiring or scale, you gain room to make better decisions. In our next blog, I want to explore why the volume based growth model became so dominant in the first place and why it no longer serves many agencies the way it once did. Not to criticize it, but to understand it. Because once you see the mechanics clearly, it becomes much easier to choose something else. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, go to agencytogether.com/about. The link is in the show notes. If agency growth advice has ever felt heavy or misaligned, I want you to hear this before we wrap up. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not lacking ambition. You're not afraid of growth. You're not doing it wrong. You're building towards a different kind of success. And that's what the small but mighty agency identity is really about. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next episode. Hey, thanks for hanging out with me at the Small But Mighty Agency podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to me if you hit the follow or subscribe button in your podcast app and share it with a friend. I'll see you on the next one.